It was November 20th, 2002, the night shift at Leeds General Infirmary. An 86-year-old woman called Ethel Hall had been recovering from a hip operation. At 5 a.m, nurses heard a noise and went to her bedside. She was unresponsive. They soon discovered what was wrong and called the doctors. Her blood sugar level was dangerously low, causing her to fall into a hypoglycemic coma from which she would never recover. Ethel Hall was thought to be the victim of a murder. But this was only the start. After her, another 3 recent deaths were reclassified as murder, along with 1 attempted murder. It seemed a serial killer was on the loose. Colin Norris, a nurse at the hospital, stood trial and in March 2008 was convicted of one of the worst medical crimes in history.
A thoroughly evil and dangerous man.
A killer who appeared to have no motive other than being irritated by the frail and elderly women.
This man, Colin Norris, was stopped in his tracks after he killed 4 and attempted to kill another person. Harold Shipman went on to kill 200-300 people. He wasn't stopped in his tracks.
There to hear the verdict in the public gallery was Colin Norris's mother, June.
I felt as if my world was just closing in. It was horrible. I couldn't believe what I'd heard. It was horrendous. I thought my world had ended. I'm sorry.
Colin Norris was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. June makes the 10-hour round trip to the Category A prison in Durham, which holds her son, every month. She has always believed in his innocence.
Have you ever doubted for a second, even for a split second,
Never.
that Colin might have done these things?
Never. Never. Because I know my son. I've just got to keep going until we eventually let people know that there has been a miscarriage of justice here and he is not guilty. He is innocent.
She isn't the only person who thinks an innocent man is in prison.
I truly believe, that he hasn't done anything wrong, and I'll always believe that. I love Colin with all my heart. He's one of my best friends, always has been, and as far as I'm concerned, always will be. And I miss him.
I've investigated claims of innocence before, but there has never been a serial killer who is innocent on all counts. So what was the case against him? Ethel Hall's hypoglycemic coma was thought to be suspicious because she was not diabetic, a condition where the body can't control sugar and insulin levels. Insulin can cause hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, and a blood test revealed Ethel Hall had huge levels of insulin in her system.
Doctors quickly ruled out a number of naturally occurring conditions, and that seemed to leave just one possible scenario, that Ethel Hall had been poisoned with a massive dose of insulin.
West Yorkshire police were called in. Colin Norris quickly came to police attention during their interviews because he'd apparently predicted Ethel Hall's collapse and had told colleagues that whenever he was on shift, someone always died. It was the lead they needed. He was arrested and taken in for questioning.
Can you give us your full name, please, Colin, and your date of birth?
Colin Campbell Norris, 12th of the 2nd, 76.
Colin Norris would answer all questions put to him in a series of interviews.
Colin, and this is your movements on the wall.
It was clear from the outset he was the prime suspect.
I've been on the scene all night because I've been at work since 9:15 the previous night.
Absolutely, but we've got you there.
Heading up the investigation was Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Gregg, the man who'd just led the review into the mass murderer Dr. Harold Shipman. Suspecting they had another medical serial killer on their hands, they began trawling through patient records. They were looking for cases of low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, just like Ethel Hall. 81 were originally identified, even though they'd all been classed as natural deaths at the time. This was narrowed down to 18, which were classed as high priority. In addition to Ethel Hall, police finally charged him with another 4 cases: the murders of Doris Ludlam, Bridget Burke, Irene Crooks, and the attempted murder of Vera Wilby. The only common denominator was Colin Norris. There was no direct forensic evidence tying Colin Norris to these deaths, and no obvious motive. So the prosecution case rests entirely on 2 things. The cluster of 4 patients where the only evidence is they became hypoglycemic whilst Colin Norris was on shift, and a blood test from the 5th patient, Ethel Hall, which sparked the whole thing off. So the first thing to re-examine is this cluster of hypoglycemic patients. Hypoglycemia is not a disease, but a warning. When we eat, the body converts food into glucose, and that provides us with energy to function. Glucose levels in the blood are controlled by a hormone called insulin, which is produced in the pancreas. If there's too much insulin, glucose levels will be driven down too low, causing dizziness, and in extreme cases, coma and brain damage, even death. Part of the case against Colin is that a cluster of 4 non-diabetic patients with hypoglycemia is so rare that there must have been foul play. Remember, each of these women was thought originally to have died from natural causes. So just how rare is it to have a cluster like this? To find out, I've come to meet the leading authority on insulin poisoning, Professor Vincent Marks. He's conducted a review of scientific studies published since the trial. So is it true that unexplained hypoglycemia in the elderly is extremely rare?
No, it's not true, and that was the main thrust of my report that I submitted. It wasn't as well known at the time of the trial as it is now that particularly the elderly, frail, sick person, hypoglycemia is far from rare. Some people assess it at 2%, others at 7%, 8% even. It was a phenomenon of their illnesses. It was not the cause of their illnesses, it was caused by their illnesses, their general debility, their frailty, their general state of health. This is now a well-recognised phenomenon.
So according to Professor Marks, the accepted science on hypoglycemia has moved on significantly since the trial. Perhaps then a cluster of 4 cases in 6 months isn't so significant after all, especially if you're looking for them. And we found a police memo which shows that's exactly what they were doing. They decided a key criteria was all the deaths in which the suspect Norris had attended at the time of death or at the time leading up to the death. There was no evidence of insulin in any of these deaths. Remember, they'd all been originally classified as natural causes, but suddenly Colin Norris was being blamed. And from that police trawl, we uncovered a case the jury never got to hear about. Lucy Rowell was 82, and just like the others, had died after falling into a hypoglycemic coma. But after her funeral, the police arrived at the family's door to tell them they suspected Lucy had been murdered by Colin Norris.
They was looking at a male nurse that had been working every evening when Grandma had slipped into a coma, along with the other patients that had died.
Believing Lucy had simply died of old age, the family was shocked. But months later, the police returned.
This particular male nurse that they'd been pursuing wasn't working the night that Grandma slipped into the coma, so she went from being suspicious to non-suspicious.
Just because he wasn't working?
Yeah. Yes.
The Lucy Rowell story suggests that some cases had been cherry-picked to create a cluster around Colin Norris. I put it to Professor Marks, did any of these 4 cases belong in a criminal court?
My conclusion was that no reliance should be placed upon the fact that there were 4 people identified who had low blood glucose levels.
And on that basis, your opinion was the convictions...
The verdict was unsafe.
Was Doris Ludlam murdered?
No.
Was Bridget Burke murdered?
No.
Irene Crooks?
No.
Vera Wilby?
No.
As a result of his convictions in relation to these 4 women, along with Ethel Hall, Colin Norris remains in prison, approaching his 7th year in high security. Back in Leeds, where the evidence began, the so-called prediction of Ethel Hall's death, I want to find out what a former colleague thought when she'd heard what Colin Norris had said.
If you listened in on any ward anywhere, it's just such normal nursing lingo that it wouldn't set any alarm bells ringing if anyone said that to me in handover, or if I said it to anyone. It is just such a normal thing. Like, what would worry you is if someone was uncaring or snappy with patients, or you heard through a curtain, and, you know, there's other things that set alarm bells, but saying flippant comments about someone being unwell or going off or the potential of someone dying isn't a worrying thing to hear. It's normal.
And there were those other alarm bells that you mentioned there, you never heard any of those with Colin?
No, not at all. He was a really good nurse.
The thing that put Norris right in the frame, this so-called prediction of Ethel Hall's collapse, well, so says Emily, that's the kind of thing that's said in hospitals and wards up and down the country every single day.
But it was a single blood test from Ethel Hall showing insulin, which was enough to get this case to court. Professor Marks believes an insulin injection fitted her clinical picture. But just how reliable are these blood tests? When Ethel Hall collapsed at 5 a.m, a blood sample was taken which showed she was hypoglycemic and glucose was given. Later, doctors discovered that sample hadn't been stored properly for insulin analysis. 7 hours later, another was taken and sent to the lab. I've come to meet an expert to ask if the result of that blood test is evidence of murder.
The crime scene, if crime scene it was seriously disturbed by the infusion of glucose. Now, clinically, that was absolutely the right decision, goodness me. The patient was hypoglycemic. To try and restore the patient, glucose was going to be needed.
The glucose meant that Ethel Hall's blood sugar had returned to normal by the time the sample that suggested poisoning was taken. The gold standard of diagnosing an insulin injection case has 3 requirements: high levels of insulin, low levels of a molecule called C-peptide, and crucially, these need to be found in a hypoglycemic sample. Ethel Hall had high insulin and low C-peptide, but when the sample was taken, she was no longer hypoglycemic. According to Professor Wilkin, this drives a fatal blow through the prosecution case.
If a test is done when the patient is not hypoglycemic, what, you can't rely on it? It's useless?
It's not a valid test. That would be my view. It's not a valid test. And I think it would be the view of biochemists the world over. If you disconnect these 3 tests in any way, over time or through samples, different samples, then you do not have a valid test. I think the forensic evidence stops there because it's invalid.
I found a scientific paper which was written by the same laboratory that carried out the work in the Ethel Hall blood test. It was written months before they did that work. And in it, they say the crucial, not to say mandatory requirement is the establishment of hypoglycemia in the sample submitted for analysis, which in the Ethel Hall case is precisely what they didn't do.
And mandatory means must. There is no qualification of the word mandatory. It means must. And that's for a clinical laboratory. Now this is now forensic evidence. This is determining a man's future in terms of guilty or not guilty. And I do find it difficult that this mandatory requirement was laid to one side in order to come to a different conclusion.
But the jury didn't get to hear that. Dr. Derek Teal, who was in charge of the lab at the time, told us that after treatment with glucose, there was still
an abnormally large amount of insulin in the circulation, together with a correspondingly low C-peptide, a situation which is unarguably consistent with an injection of insulin.
Colin Norris's case is currently being considered by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or CCRC, which will decide if the case should go back to appeal. The CCRC has consulted Dr. Matthew Joel on another insulin homicide case. What does he think about the standard of evidence in the Norris trial?
It's, I think, unconscionable to put a person on trial for murder with a presumptive test, one sample partially analyzed. I mean, that's really what we're sitting at, with no supporting evidence, no injection marks, no signs of an insulin depot. There's no witnesses. There's no empty syringe. There's no empty vial. There's nothing else connecting him to this case.
But Ethel Hall did have a huge amount of insulin in her blood. Poisoning is one explanation, but could there be another, less sinister diagnosis that was missed? One scientist thought there might be, and he contacted the defence team back in 2008.
There is a condition, there is a disease, a syndrome called insulin autoimmune hypoglycemia, because it can cause low blood glucose. It was a spanner in the work because it was completely new to the defence side, this particular fact.
What Colin Norris's defence did was that they accepted that the Ethel Hall blood test was correct and that she had been given a malicious dose of insulin.
Yeah.
But that their case was that it wasn't Colin, it must have been someone else.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know this line of defence.
You explained to them that there might be another cause.
Yeah, they were completely unaware of this. So I was talking about things which they never heard, they never thought, they never investigated. And this was 3 weeks after the trial has started. So it was really quite a very hard work to come at that point in time and start raising a completely new issue.
So what is insulin autoimmune syndrome, and could it have caused Ethel's condition? The immune system, usually the body's first-line defence mechanism against infection, can sometimes turn on itself, creating antibodies that misfire and attack a healthy body. Antibodies can wreak havoc with normal insulin levels, and like an injection of insulin, can cause hypoglycemia and, if left unchecked, coma. So did doctors even consider this condition before they diagnosed insulin poisoning?
We've been through more than 40 boxes of trial documents, and we can find no evidence that at the time of Ethel Hall's collapse, doctors and scientists even considered insulin autoimmune syndrome. And we know that they didn't conduct crucial tests. But 6 years later, at trial, they were confident enough to rule the syndrome out.
You can't absolutely exclude it until you've done the one thing that by which the syndrome is defined, which is measure antibodies to insulin in the sample.
The lab tested for one type of antibody, but failed to check for all.
It can't be ruled out with certainty.
These tests will cost few pounds. You have the test available. You know it can be tested for. You know the test can give you categorical confirmation or refuting the presence of the disease. No ifs and no buts.
I wanted to speak to someone who'd actually seen this condition. Professor Wilkin had worked on a case in the 80s which was correctly diagnosed as insulin autoimmune syndrome before anyone suspected poisoning.
I think that but for the grace of God, nobody was suspected of giving exogenous insulin, because if somebody had raised their finger and said, well, could this be malicious?
Someone, of course, did point the finger at Colin Norris, and at trial, when insulin autoimmune was raised as a last-minute alternative, no fewer than 7 experts dismissed it as too rare and inconsistent with Ethel Hall's blood test results. Were they right?
Is the blood test and the symptoms of Ethel Hall and her coma and eventual death, are all those things consistent with insulin autoimmune?
The data that has come from the analysis that was done on the samples that were given to the laboratory is perfectly consistent with insulin autoimmune syndrome. So if you're asking the question, does insulin autoimmune syndrome fit with the facts of the case as reported, then yes, it does.
Another reason cited by the trial experts for ruling out the syndrome in Ethel Hall's case is that it principally affected Japanese people who have a genetic predisposition to it. Again, science has moved on since the trial, and we found more than 60 cases in peer-reviewed academic journals, and all of those are Caucasian.
Now, it's no longer a very rare condition. 60 cases is not insubstantial.
The advances in science are no surprise for Colin Norris or his mother.
It's taken us nearly 7 years to get to where we are just now, and a lot of the research and everything that we've got has just it wasn't available at the time of the trial, so there might be more stuff that will come in the future.
Just as we were finishing our investigation, I was contacted again by Professor Wilkin, who had collaborated on more research with a mathematician. I knew police claimed Ethel Hall had been injected with 10 mils of insulin, about 2 teaspoons, but were their calculations correct? If the dose required is really large, that would seriously question whether poisoning by injection was even possible. The new calculation combines the absorption rate of insulin with the time it takes to leave the bloodstream.
The amount of insulin that would have been required, the amount of insulin injection, was just over 1 litre. Now, that is a 20 millilitre syringe. If I draw that up to 20 millilitres, I would have to inject that much 50 times to have injected 1 litre. So I think that's unrealistic.
These calculations are based on the most likely insulin absorption rates, but every human is different. So they recalculated using a far more conservative scale, just in case.
We doubled it. The requirement would have been something like 35 millilitres of insulin. And again, that seems quite unrealistic, because that's 3.5 10 millilitre syringes, whereas a normal insulin injection is just 1 millilitre or 2.
Are you saying that the data suggests that the amount of insulin found in Ethel Hall's blood is unlikely to have been caused by an injection of insulin?
It seems unlikely. On the balance of probabilities, it seems unlikely, because the dose of insulin required to have reduced them seems to be much higher than could realistically have been given.
So if those calculations are correct, and an insulin injection is unlikely, with a prosecution case so heavily based on one blood sample, where does that leave the evidence against Colin Norris?
None of the relevant trial experts we contacted answered our questions about insulin autoimmune syndrome or insulin levels. We invited West Yorkshire Police to an interview to discuss the new evidence. They gave a statement.
The case is currently under review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and we will consider their findings when they are presented to us.
The BBC will be making all of the new evidence in Colin Norris's case available to the Commission.
What began as a mother's plea to investigate her son's convictions has caused me to question not only whether a completely innocent man is in prison, but also whether anyone was murdered in this case at all. If a jury today saw the evidence revealed in this programme, would they have come to the same decision?
There are only 12 people who could answer that question. Jurors' names are read out in open court, and so I contacted people by the same name to try and track them down. Jurors are not allowed to talk about their deliberations, but they can talk about some things. Finally, one man contacted me, juror number 8, and he was prepared to look at our evidence.
Well, it was funny. After the trial, I got home, and I got home, and I had a bit cry to myself, thinking, have I did the right thing here? You know, have I made the right decision?
Did you think Colin Norris was guilty?
On the evidence I've shown, yeah. Yeah. The evidence I've seen, yeah, he was guilty.
You're the first juror to have looked at this new evidence. What's your reaction to it?
It just throws a new light to it. I mean, it could, if that evidence was sort of the new evidence now, I mean, if that was available at the time, I mean, I think it would have thrown the case out, to be honest.
Do you still think Colin Norris is guilty?
After seeing the new evidence, no.
How do you feel now about the verdict?
Very doubtful. That would come to the right conclusion. Very doubtful.